The lantern went out 3 times that night before Jacob Riley finally gave up trying to keep it lit, and he sat there in the dark of his own barn with a half-dead calf in his lap and no more tricks left in his hands to save it, the wind screaming through gaps in the boards his father had never gotten around to patching. He had already lost 11 head that winter. He could not afford to lose this one too, and yet here it was, going still and cold against his knees while he knelt in old straw and did not pray, because he had stopped believing. Prayer changed anything the day his wife died with their 3rd child never drawing breath at all. He did not hear the door. He only felt the cold air rush in and looked up to see a woman standing in the frame of it, with snow in her dark hair. A woman the whole valley had already spent a week warning him against, and she did not ask permission. She simply walked in, knelt down across from him, and put her hands on the calf, like she already knew exactly what its body needed, and his did not. If you have ever been so far down in a hard season that you stopped believing anyone was coming to help you, stay with this one all the way through, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because this is the story of a woman this whole valley tried to keep out, and what she built instead. With hands nobody bothered to ask about first. Jacob Riley had been a rancher his whole life, the way his father had been before him, out on a stretch of hard country in the New Mexico territory that gave up its living reluctantly, in good years, and gave up almost nothing at all in bad ones. He had married young, a soft-spoken woman named Mary, who had filled his house with the kind of noise a house needs to feel, lived in, and when she died in childbirth 2 winters back, taking the baby with her, Jacob had gone quiet in a way that frightened the men who worked for him more than any temper could have. Once it settles in deep enough, has a way of curdling into something that looks a great deal like giving up. He had 3 children left to raise, and he raised them the only way he knew how in those days, which was to feed them and clothe them and otherwise leave them mostly to themselves, believing, in the particular blindness of a grieving man, that this was enough, that a full stomach and a roof counted as care. His eldest, a girl of 13 named Charlotte, had taken over the running of the house without anyone asking her to, and without anyone thanking her for it either, cooking and mending and minding her younger siblings with a grim competence that made the neighbor women murmur about what a fine little housekeeper she was, never once asking whether a girl of 13 ought to have a childhood left over after all that keeping house was done. His middle child, a boy named Daniel, 10 years old and furious at the whole world in the particular way boys get furious when grief has nowhere else to go, picked fights at the schoolhouse and broke things around the ranch that did not need breaking, and Jacob, in his own fog, mistook the boy's fury for meanness rather than what it actually was, which was grief with no other language available to it. And his youngest, a girl named Ivy, only 5 when her mother died, had gone almost entirely silent in the 2 years since, speaking only when spoken to directly and otherwise communicating through small drawings she made with a stub of pencil on scraps of paper, pictures of birds mostly, and once, disturbingly, a picture of an empty chair at a table full of people. Into this house in the coldest winter the valley had seen in a decade came Alutsi. She had grown up Chiricahua Apache before the Army's campaigns scattered her people across reservations that stretched from Arizona into Florida and back again, and she had survived those years the way her people survived most things, by being useful in ways the world around her could not easily dismiss. Healing wounds and reading weather and knowing land the way other people knew their own kitchens. She had come to the valley 2 winters before, taking work where she could find it, and had built herself a small reputation among the ranch wives as a woman who could turn a sick animal around when the local horse doctor had already given up, though that reputation traveled alongside a second, uglier one, whispered in the mercantile and after church, about what kind of woman took up that trade, and what her being good at it might really mean. She had come to the Riley barn that night because Charlotte, 13 years old and desperate, and already more of a mother to that household than anyone had a right to ask of her, had ridden 2 miles through blowing snow to fetch her. Having heard from a neighbor girl that the Apache woman near the crossing had saved 3 calves already that winter that everyone else had written off as lost. "Please," Charlotte had said, standing in Illuzi's doorway, shaking with cold and fear both. "My father's out there, and I don't think he even knows he's given up. Please come." Illuzi had not hesitated. She never hesitated when a child asked her for help in that particular voice, the voice of someone who had learned too early that adults sometimes needed reminding to keep trying. She saved the calf that night, warming it with her own coat and a slow, patient rubbing of its limbs that brought the blood back into motion, working until near dawn while Jacob watched her with the particular helpless gratitude of a man too proud to say thank you properly and too exhausted to pretend otherwise. "You didn't have to come," he said finally as the gray light came up outside the barn doors. "Your daughter asked," Illuzi said simply, "and I've never been able to say no to a child who's had to do too much asking already." She looked at him a long moment, taking his measure the way she seemed to take the measure of everything, weather and animals and men alike. "You have 3 children in that house, Mr. Riley, and only one of them is being raised. The other 2 are only being kept." He did not answer her, because he did not have an answer, and because something in the plain truth of what she'd said sat in his chest like a stone he could not immediately name. She came back the next week to check on the calf, and the week after that to look in on a horse with a bad hoof. And somewhere in those visits, without either of them quite deciding it should happen, she began staying longer than the animals strictly required. Sitting at the kitchen table while Charlotte served coffee, with the studied formality of a girl trying very hard to seem grown, watching Daniel's furious silences with an attention that unsettled him because it was not the attention of judgment, only of interest, and drawing slowly, wordless Ivy out of her shell of silence, with nothing more than patient presence and a willingness to sit beside her and look at her bird drawings without demanding she speak about them. It was Ivy, in fact, who broke first, 3 weeks into Illuzi's visits, holding up a drawing of a bird with an unusually long tail and asking, in a voice roughened from disuse, "Do you know what kind this is?" It was the first full sentence anyone in that house had heard her speak in 8 months, and Charlotte, standing at the stove, went completely still, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed it to happen. Illuzi looked at the drawing with the same unhurried seriousness. She gave everything. "That looks like a scissor tail," she said. "They come through this valley in the spring. I can show you one if you'd like, when the weather turns." "Really?" Ivy said, and there was something in that single word, some small opening door, that made Jacob's chest go tight in a way he had not felt since before Mary died. "Really?" Illuzi said. "I keep my promises." By the time the worst of the winter had passed, Illuzi had become, without any formal arrangement ever being spoken aloud, something closer to a fixture in the Riley household than a hired hand or a passing neighbor. And the valley had noticed, and the valley, as valleys do, had opinions. Mrs. Louisa Kettering, whose late husband had once held the largest spread in the valley before losing most of it to bad debts and worse decisions, had appointed herself, in the years since, the moral compass of every family within a day's ride, and she considered Jacob Riley's situation a matter requiring urgent correction. She cornered him after church one bitter Sunday, her voice pitched low and honeyed in the particular way of a woman who has spent years perfecting the art of cruelty disguised as concern. "We only say this because we care for those children, Jacob," she said. "An Apache woman, alone in that house with 3 motherless babies. You don't know what she might teach them, or worse, what she might take from them. Blood tells, in the end, whatever kindness she puts on for company." Jacob did not answer her that day. He had learned, in 2 years of grief-soaked silence, that some arguments were not worth having, that a woman like Louisa Kettering fed on resistance the way a fire feeds on air. But he carried her words home with him anyway, the way a man carries a splinter he tells himself he'll deal with later, feeling a needle at him with every small kindness. He watched Illuzi extend to his children over the weeks that followed. Daniel noticed his father's new quiet before anyone else did, because Daniel had spent 2 years watching for exactly this kind of retreat, the kind that meant an adult was about to take something good away, because someone else had told them to be afraid of it. "You're gonna send her away," the boy said one evening, not as a question, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed in the defensive posture that had become his permanent architecture since his mother's death. Because of what people are saying in town, I heard Mrs. Kettering talking after church. I heard what she called her. Daniel, Ivy talks now, Daniel said, and his voice cracked on it. The fury finally showing its true shape, which had always been grief-wearing armor. She didn't talk for 2 years, and now she talks. And you're going to let some old woman in a fancy hat scare her back into being quiet again, because you're too much of a coward to tell her to mind her own business. Jacob stood there in his own kitchen, 13 years old's worth of a boy's fury landing on him with the precision of a much older accusation, and he did not have an answer ready because his son was not wrong, and some part of him had known it before Daniel ever said it out loud. It was Iluzi herself, arriving the next morning to look in on a mare close to foaling, who found him sitting on the porch rail in the cold, turning the question over without arriving anywhere useful. "You've gone quiet," she said, settling beside him without waiting to be invited, which had become, by then, its own kind of permission between them. A different quiet than usual. "Folks talk," he said finally. "About you being out here so much. About what it means." "I know what they say," Iluzi answered, and there was no bitterness in it, only a weariness that ran deeper than the months he'd known her, deeper probably than he could see to the bottom of. "I've heard it my whole life, Jacob. I heard it as a girl, when the army moved us off land my grandmother was born on. I heard it every winter since I came to this valley, looking for honest work. It will not stop because you wish it to. It only tells you what kind of people are doing the talking and what kind of fear they're covering up with it. I'm not asking you to carry that weight," he said. "You're not," she agreed, "but you're asking yourself whether you can carry it. That's a different question, and it isn't mine to answer for you." He did not answer it that day either. It would take the spring, and everything the spring brought with it, to force the answer fully out of him. The trouble, when it came, arrived on 2 fronts at once, the way trouble in that country so often seemed to, as though hardship had learned to travel in pairs for efficiency's sake. The first was a banknote Jacob had taken against the ranch 2 winters before, in the black months after Mary's death, when he had not been thinking clearly enough to refuse easy money that came with hard strings attached. The note was held by a man named Ezra Colt, who ran the bank in the county seat and had a reputation well earned for calling in debts the moment they became inconvenient to hold. Colt rode out personally that spring, sat in Jacob's kitchen with his hat in his lap, and explained, in the mild, regretful tones of a man delivering bad news he'd rehearsed enjoying, that certain members of the bank's board had grown uneasy about extending further patience to a rancher who'd taken up, as Colt delicately phrased it, unconventional domestic arrangements, and that the note would need to be settled in full by autumn, or the ranch would be sold to cover it. The second front was smaller in scale but sharper in its cruelty. A fever that swept through the schoolhouse that spring and took hold of Ivy first, burning through her small body for 4 days straight while Jacob sat at her bedside remembering, with a terror that felt like drowning every hour of the 4 days that had taken Mary from him. He sent for the town doctor, a careful, overworked man named Foster, who did what he could and admitted, on the 3rd night, that he had run out of ideas that were working. It was Iluzi who sat with Ivy those 4 nights, steeping barks and roots Foster-eyed with open skepticism until, exhausted past arguing, he simply let her work, and it was Iluzi's hands that finally brought the fever down in the gray hour before the 4th dawn. Ivy's small body going slack with relief, rather than the terrible stillness Jacob had feared with his whole chest for 4 straight days. He found Iluzi afterward on the porch, the sky just beginning to gray at its edges, and he said the thing he had been unable to say through every one of those 4 nights. "I thought I was going to lose her the same way I lost her mother," he said, and his voice broke clean in half on the word mother, 2 years of held-together silence finally giving way. "I didn't know how I was going to keep breathing if that happened twice." "You weren't going to lose her," Iluzi said, and there was no false comfort in it, only the same plain certainty she brought to everything. But I understand why you were afraid of it anyway. Fear doesn't wait for facts before it takes hold, Jacob. It only waits for an opening. Why do you keep coming back here? He asked her then, the question he had been circling for months finally landing plainly between them. When the whole valley makes it so hard on you for doing it. She was quiet a moment, looking out at the graying sky. Because your daughter asked me to, that first night, she said, and because I have watched 3 children in this house come back to life these past months, one small piece at a time, and I have decided that is worth more to me than whatever Louisa Kettering thinks she knows about my blood. She looked at him directly then, and because somewhere in these months, Jacob Riley, I stopped coming here only for the children. He did not have words ready for that either, but he reached over, in the gray hour before dawn, and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and she let him, and neither of them said anything further, because some things, once said plainly, did not need repeating to be understood. He told her about cold snow 2 days later, the whole of it, the autumn deadline, the board's unease, the ranch his father had built, standing to be sold out from under him because of exactly the fear Louisa Kettering had been stoking all winter. Iluzzi listened without interrupting, the way she listened to everything. And when he finished, she was quiet a long moment, looking out over his dry spring pasture. "You have more cattle on this land than you think you do," she said finally. "Not counted ones you've written off as lost or scattered these past 2 winters, when you were too deep in your own grief to go looking properly. There's a box canyon 2 miles north of your line fence, sheltered enough that strays drift into it for the winter grass, and don't drift back out again without help. I've seen tracks there all season. I think if we ride it properly, we'll find more of your herd alive than dead." "You've been counting my cattle," Jacob said, something between disbelief and wonder in it. "I've been paying attention to your land," Iluzzi said. "The same as I pay attention to everything. It costs nothing, and it tells you more than most men bother to learn." They rode out 3 days later, Jacob and Iluzzi and Cobb Whitfield, an old hand who'd worked the Riley spread since Jacob's father ran it, and who had watched Iluzzi's growing place in the household with an old cowman's wary silence that had not yet resolved itself into either approval or complaint. They found the box canyon exactly where she said it would be, and inside it, sheltered from 2 winters' worth of hard weather, nearly 40 head of cattle Jacob had long since written off as dead or stolen, fat on canyon grass and multiplied besides by calves born in that shelter, that no one had known to count. Cobb took off his hat and stood there, a long moment, just looking at the herd, the way a man looks at money he'd already spent grieving. 40 head, he said. We'd have found this ourselves eventually. Eventually is a word men use when they mean never, Iluzzi said, not unkindly, and your rancher didn't have eventually left to spend. He had until autumn. With that herd added back to his count, and with calving season bringing fat, healthy numbers on top of it, Jacob rode into the county seat that summer and laid the full accounting in front of Ezra Colt, personally, watching the careful banker's face do arithmetic it had not expected to be asked to do. The Riley herd, once thought decimated by 2 hard winters, had in fact very nearly doubled since the note was first taken, and Colt, whatever his board's private prejudices, was not fool enough to call in a note against a rancher whose numbers had just proven themselves stronger than anyone's fear about his household arrangements. The note was quietly extended on its original terms, and Colt, riding back to the county seat, said nothing further about unconventional domestic arrangements, though Jacob understood well enough that the man's private opinions had traveled nowhere near as far as his public arithmetic had been forced to. It reached its cruelest point that same summer, at the Founders' Day gathering the whole valley turned out for every year, tables of food and a fiddle player and every rancher and shopkeeper and their families crowded onto the church green under a hot blue sky. Jacob brought Iluzzi that year, the first time he had ever brought her to a gathering of the whole valley together, and the crowd went quiet, in the particular way crowds go quiet when everyone in them is working hard not to be seen staring. Louisa Kettering found her opening within the hour, cornering the two of them near the pie tables with a smile that never once reached her eyes. "It's remarkable what you've done for the Riley children," she said to Aluzi, pitched to carry to the tables nearest them. "Playing nursemaid, playing rancher. I suppose it comes naturally to your kind. Being useful to white families in whatever way keeps you fed. It must be gratifying, being needed like that." The green did not go silent so much as it seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether this humiliation would land, the way Louisa clearly intended it to, whether Aluzi would flinch, whether Jacob would smooth it over the way men in his position so often did, with an uneasy laugh and a change of subject that let the whole crowd move on without anyone having to answer for what had just been said. Aluzi did not flinch. "I was raised to notice what other people walk past without seeing," she said evenly, without a trace of anger in it, though every word landed with the full weight of something long practiced and long deserved. "My grandmother taught me to read a sick animal's breathing and a fevered child's pulse before I ever learned to read words on a page. It is not usefulness to white families, Mrs. Kettering. It is knowledge. My people kept alive through worse winters than this valley has ever seen, and I would have kept it and used it, whether the Riley children existed or not. You mistake generosity for servitude because you've never once had to be generous with anything that cost you real comfort to give." A ripple went through the nearest tables, and old Cobb Whitfield, standing close enough to hear every word of it, let out a short bark of a laugh. He did not bother to swallow this time. Louisa's mouth thinned into a hard line. "Well," she started. "I know precisely what you meant," Aluzi said, still calm, still unhurried, and it was the calm more than anything that seemed to rattle the older woman deeper than any raised voice could have managed. "You have meant it every time you've looked at me, since the day I rode into this valley, and you will go on meaning it, whether I answer you gently or not. So I have decided, standing here today, to stop being gentle about it." Jacob, standing at her side, felt something rise in his chest that he had not felt in over 2 years. Something it took him a moment to name as pride, clean and sharp and entirely without apology in it. He set his hand against the small of Aluzi's back, not to steer her away from the confrontation, but simply to stand beside her, visibly, in front of every family in that valley. "This woman brought my daughter back from a fever I nearly lost her to," he said, loud enough to carry across the whole green. "She found 40 head of my own cattle I'd given up as dead, and doubled my herd inside a season through nothing but paying attention where the rest of us had stopped looking. She taught my silent daughter to speak again, and my angriest son to trust an adult again, neither of which I managed on my own in 2 years of trying. Anyone standing on this green who has a quarrel with her standing here today has a quarrel with me standing right beside her tonight and every day after." It was more than Jacob Riley had said in public since before his wife's funeral, and the green did not erupt into applause, because gatherings like that one rarely did, not in that country in that particular season, but something in it shifted anyway, a current running underneath the surface the way water runs beneath ground that only looks dead from above. Louisa Kettering left the Founders' Day gathering early, and though she did not stop talking entirely in the months that followed, women like her rarely stopped entirely, only quieted for a season while they waited for a fresh opening. The shape of what the valley believed about Aluzi had cracked open that day, letting something through that had been waiting the whole while to be seen plainly. It was Ruth Colt, Ezra Colt's own wife, who delivered the valley's clearest reversal that autumn, standing up unprompted at a church social to say, in a voice that shook slightly with the effort of saying it at all, that she had watched Aluzi nurse her own sister's boy through the same fever that had nearly taken Ivy Riley, asking nothing in return and refusing every attempt at payment, and that she for one was ashamed of how long she had let gossip stand in for gratitude. It was a small speech, delivered awkwardly by a woman unused to public correction of her neighbors, but it did more to shift the valley's remaining doubt than any argument Jacob himself could have made. Jacob asked Lucy to marry him that same autumn, at the edge of the box canyon where she had first shown him the 40 head of cattle he'd believed lost forever, the exact place where she had proven, plainly and without argument, that his own land had been holding more for him all along than his grief had allowed him to see. He did not make a long speech of it. He had never been a man for long speeches, and a year of knowing her had taught him she did not need one, that she preferred a plain truth set down between them like something laid gently on a counter, more than she would ever prefer pretty words wrapped around an uncertain feeling. "I don't have much left to offer you that your own hands haven't already earned twice over," he said. "This ranch is as much yours as it is mine or my children's if you'll have it, and I'm asking you to have me along with it." She looked at him a long moment, the way she had looked at him that first snowbound night in the barn, like a woman taking the measure of something she was already most of the way toward understanding, except that this time there was nothing left to measure. Only a decision already made somewhere across a year of small kindnesses, hard-won trust, and one public humiliation, answered without flinching. "Stay," she said, which was not quite an answer to his question, and was entirely an answer all the same. "And I'll have all of it, you, the land, and every one of those children, for as long as you'll all still want me." "You're not going anywhere," Jacob said. "Not after everything you've already built here. This is home now. It was home the night you walked into my barn and didn't wait to be asked." They were married that winter, a year, almost to the day, since she had first walked through the barn door with snow in her hair, in a small ceremony at the ranch house rather than the church in town, though the church would have had them by then, valley opinion having turned the slow. Grudging way opinion turns when the plain facts on the ground refuse to keep cooperating with old fears. Cobb Whitfield stood as Jacob's witness, openly emotional in a way none of the hands had ever seen from him before. Ruth, Colt came, and Dr. Foster, and a dozen neighbor families who had come, across that hard year, to think of Lucy as something closer to the woman who'd saved the valley's own children than a curiosity to whisper about after church. Charlotte no longer required to carry a house entirely on her own 13-year-old shoulders, cried through the whole short ceremony, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes when a weight finally sets itself down. Daniel stood beside his father, looking for the first time in 2 years, like a boy, rather than a coiled fist, waiting for the next unfairness to land. And Ivy, 5 going on 7 now, drew a picture that same week of the whole family standing together beneath a scissor-tailed bird in flight, no empty chair anywhere in it, and gave the drawing to Lucy without being asked, the way she had learned across that year, that some things were simply given rather than requested. They built a life on that ranch together that neither of them had quite dared hope for in the hard months before, in the days when Jacob had been a silent widower going through motions he no longer believed sustained anything, and Lucy had been a woman who had learned, through long, hard experience, to expect suspicion rather than welcome from the world she moved through. She taught him, over the years that followed, more than the location of one hidden canyon full of cattle. She taught him to read weather 3 days out by the particular color the western sky took on before a hard freeze, knowledge that saved his herd twice more in years to come. She taught Daniel, whose fury had finally found somewhere useful to go, to track and read land the way she read it, until the boy grew into a young man, other ranchers hired specifically for his eye. She taught Charlotte that keeping a house and having a childhood were not mutually exclusive, however hard that lesson had been to absorb after years of believing otherwise. And she kept teaching Ivy the names of every bird that passed through that valley, a promise made and kept and renewed every spring for years afterward. The herd, once nearly lost to 2 brutal winters and a season of Jacob's private despair, had more than doubled by that first harvest after their marriage, and kept growing steadily in the years that followed, until the Riley outfit was spoken of, in time, the way certain outfits get spoken of in cattle country. as the one that always seemed to know where its strays had gotten to, the one that never lost what other outfits simply gave up on finding. Years later, when Jacob and Alutzi's grandchildren asked, as children always eventually ask, how their grandparents had come to build a life together, it was old Cobb Whitfield, bent nearly double with age but sharp as ever in the telling, who told it best, sitting on the porch of the Riley ranch house in the long gold light of an autumn evening. "Whole Valley told your grandfather she'd bring him nothing but trouble," he'd say. And there was no bitterness left in the telling of it, only the deep satisfaction of a man who had watched a hard truth prove itself out over years, rather than a single gossiping season. Told him, blood told in the end, whatever foolishness that phrase was ever supposed to mean. Told him a fever would take that little girl, the same as it nearly took her mother. Told him a banker in the county seat would take the whole ranch out from under him. Besides, and your grandfather, God love him, was never much of a man for arguing a point out loud, but he answered every last one of them anyway. Doubled his herd by that first harvest, got his silent daughter talking and his angry son settled and his oldest girl her childhood back, all in the same hard year everybody said would ruin him. That was his answer, every bit of it, and he never once had to raise his voice to give it. The old-timers left in that valley, the ones who remembered that particular hard winter and the long healing season that followed it, would tell you, if you caught them on the right kind of evening with the right kind of quiet settled over the porch, that the true lesson of the Riley Ranch was never really about cattle at all, though the cattle certainly mattered, and it was never really about a fever breaking, though the fever breaking certainly mattered too. It was about a whole valley nearly ruining itself trying to decide who deserved to belong within its borders, and about two people who decided, together and without waiting for anyone's permission, to build something worth having anyway, in full view of everyone who told them it couldn't be done. It was about a man who had gone quiet with grief until a woman taught him, patiently and without asking for anything in return at first, that silence could be broken, that children who'd stopped speaking could speak again, that land that looked used up and used over could still be made to give, if someone patient enough and humble enough was willing to go looking properly for what it was still holding. Home in the end was never simply the acres a man's father had fenced and claimed before him. Home was the barn door that opened in a snowstorm and let somebody in instead of keeping them out, and stayed open every season after, because two people had been brave enough to build a family in it together, in plain sight of everyone who said they shouldn't.